Well, this is now my last opportunity to speak with you, and Ken will take the very final session. And also, I've already seen just from things right around here at the front, there are a lot of questions left. So we'll look forward to 7 o'clock tonight or over lunch or things like that if you've got some questions you'd like to take up. Since this is my last session, it might be good if I start simply by reviewing the story, reviewing what we've been talking about, and building on that. So if you want to, you can kind of relax for a moment and let your minds drift back in time. In fact, let your minds drift all the way back in time, all the way back to the very beginning of time itself. Well, in the beginning was hydrogen. And at first that hydrogen was pressed together into some kind of ball of matter. For reasons we may never fully understand or appreciate, that ball of matter exploded in a big bang that sent dust and gas and radiation into the ever-expanding reaches of our universe. And then under the influence of gravity, eddies begin to develop. Particles begin to come together to coalesce to form galaxies. Within the galaxies, the stars began to shine. Around those stars, cold material coalesced to form the planets. Of all the hundreds and millions and billions of planets that must have been formed in a manner like this, one is this teeny chunk of rock we call home, the Earth. Well, at first the Earth was quite a different place than it is now. Lightning flashed back and forth in an atmosphere of methane and ammonia. For perhaps 2 billion years, that's all there was, as molecules washed back and forth on the lifeless shores of the Earth, until finally, just by chance, a group of molecules got together that could reproduce, and life on Earth began. About 600 million years ago, we pick up the first simple beginnings of life, forms like those trilobites and other sea creatures. About 400 million years ago, the first land plants and animals appear in the sequence. Then finally, about 4 million years ago, the first ape takes those upright steps toward becoming a human being, and man appears in the sequence. Man, of course, is the first animal that's able to look back over the history of his own evolutionary development. As he does so, he learns things that are helpful in understanding himself and his nature. Why is it that we do things that are harmful and hurtful to our own kind? It's that jungle fight for survival that brought us into being in the first place. But we're not without hope. We're already beginning to take control of that molecule of heredity, DNA. We're already reaching for the stars. There's simply no limit to what man can do. How'd that sound? Pretty good summary of the scientific case for creation. Did that sound like I was quoting from Genesis 1 and 2? Not quite. Did it sound like Ken Ham? No, not even Ken Ham. But what I just told you is a story that is very familiar to you, isn't it? It's a story that you've heard over and over again, whether you wanted to or not. Newspapers, magazines, television, textbooks, museum displays. And of course, what I just told you is the story of evolution. That phrase that I started with, by the way, wasn't mine either. That was a real direct quote from a famous astronomer of years gone by, Harlow Shapley. And he put it this way: some people very piously record in the beginning God, but I say in the beginning hydrogen. And he went on to say, give me hydrogen, and I can give you the universe, and we can be done once and for all with the myths and fables about a God or gods who created things. I think to give the evolutionists credit, many evolutionists understand much more fully than the average Christian the real foundational spiritual struggle between creation and evolution. That's one reason they get pretty uptight about it. And so they do understand that this is a totally different world and life view that has a totally different idea of how we ought to regard ourselves, how we ought to regard our neighbors, our friends, and society, what goals we ought to have. Evolution is in no sense a simple scientific theory or even a scientific theory at all. It's an alternate religion. And as a religion, evolution makes statements about God, about sin, and about salvation. Now, evolutionists don't make a lot of statements about God, of course, but they do make one. Once in a while, an evolutionist will say, well, if there is a God back there at the beginning, you know, that may be all right. In fact, the story goes that at the end of his message on evolution, a little girl came up to Harlow Shapley and said, but sir, where did the hydrogen come from? And Shapley said, that's an unfair question. And so they recognize, in a way, matter doesn't seem to really have the attributes of eternity. How did you get started in the first place, and so on. And so some evolutionists will graciously concede that there might be a God. If you want to believe in a God, it's all right to have a God way back there before the Big Bang. But that's the last thing he ever did for us, was cause that matter to explode. And so it's a non-meddling God, the way one professor put it in the debate. A God who doesn't interfere with the operation of nature or human affairs. Well, praise God. God isn't a non-meddling God. He's a God who's personally concerned with us moment by moment. But in the evolutionary religion, God is a matter of indifference. God is a figment of the human imagination. We've made up our image of God in our own image of what he ought to be. Well, what about sin? Again, evolution has a doctrine of sin, and evolutionists are kind of perplexed that human beings do things that don't seem to make any sense, even in terms of evolution. Why is it? It's not sin, it's not a failure to conform to the laws of God, it's those animal instincts that brought us into being in the first place. And it's those animal instincts that actually enabled us to rise above, kill off, and eliminate the competition and pave the way for human progress. And this is the way Carl Sagan looked at it. When you talk about where human beings come from, this is his particular view. Only through the deaths of an immense number of slightly maladapted organisms, only through continuous struggle and death, struggle and death, struggle and death, only through these mutations, these accidental changes, are we, brains and all, here today. And so they see a lot of things going on. It's those animal instincts, that constant struggle to the death that brought us into being. And so they do recognize the problem. Now that we've succeeded in coming into being, what are we going to do? How are we going to tame those animal instincts? If there's no God outside us who can help us with the very genes that are fighting against us on the inside, how are we going to save ourselves? Well, the answer is pay your taxes, support science, and we can bring heaven on earth. If you'll simply support science enough, we can actually give you utopia. We can now control DNA itself. We can actually splice out the bad genes, splice in the good genes, and so on. Before, we had to depend on just social control, but now we can chemically alter. We can rebuild man. We can make him better than he was, stronger, faster, brighter, and so on. Now, one thing for sure, never underestimate the power of evolution as religion. To tell you the truth, as a science, evolution doesn't have very much to offer. It's not particularly challenging. But as an evolution, or as a religion, evolution has a lot to offer. And I've already told you several times that I used to believe and teach evolution as I taught University of Biology, and I felt good about that. Here I was part of the team, the wave of the future that was really going to bring heaven on earth and solve all kinds of human problems. To me, it looked like Christians were always talking about back to God, back to the Bible, back to this, back to that. For me as an evolutionist, the best was yet to come, and I as a scientist and a science teacher was going to help to bring it. And so never underestimate the power of evolution as religion. It has a lot of appeal for a lot of different people. Well, given that, you might wonder, what is it that changed me from my belief in evolution to creation? Well, I have to admit, it happened in the most roundabout manner. I wasn't looking for God. Little did I know he was looking for me. But I finished my master's degree, and in those days you could get a university teaching position with a master's degree, so I sent off applications and so on to see what would happen. Well, the first job offer I got was from a Christian university. There are quite a number of them back in America. Now that kind of surprised me because at the time I wasn't a Christian. I was surprised that they were interested in me, but they offered to fly my wife and I on one of these big planes over for an interview, and at that time I'd never been on one of those big planes before. It sounded like a nice chance for a little vacation and so we decided to go over for the job interview, and here it is, a beautiful 85-acre wooded campus, 3 slimy lakes full of algae and junk and debris, a biologist's paradise. And then came the offer, $5,800 a year. No way I could turn down that. So off I went to begin my university teaching career at this particular Christian university. Well, I thought as long as I'm in this Christian environment, maybe you ought to find out something what Christians believe. So we decided, my wife and I, we'd set off for church on Sunday. Seemed like a good place to go. Well, somehow we never actually found a church. We always found a restaurant. That's not hard to do in America. We never found a church. And the chemistry professor at this particular Christian university noticed that and invited us over to his home for Bible study. Now, I thought that was positively amusing, that people in the 20th century would still study a dusty, old, outmoded book like the Bible. But coffee and donuts. All the free coffee and donuts I could eat if I just show up for this Bible study. Well, there are 3 key words in my vocabulary there: free, coffee, and donuts. So we decided to make Tuesday evening a regular habit and set off to do that. And just to make sure that, keep the discussion honest, I resolved to point out all the errors and mistakes and things like this in the Bible. And there were errors and mistakes all over the place. Trouble is, they were all mine. This was a pretty good Bible teacher that I had here. And so that got to be a little irritating to constantly be on the short end of things, but coffee and donuts, we kept going back anyway. Well, about that time, I got a copy in the mail of the first books that I'd ever written. One was on DNA, that molecule of heredity, and the other was on the structure and function of the cell. Now, these were textbooks in biology, and they'd been reviewed by experts in the field and so on, and represented the latest and greatest knowledge in science at the present time. But as I took the cover off the package that came in the mail, saw the book title and my name on the cover, it had a life-changing impact. Up until that time, I thought that people who wrote books knew what they were talking about. But I'd written those books. And again, even though they'd been reviewed by experts in the field and so on, we knew all of the uncertainties that went into them. In those days, we didn't know whether DNA read the same left to right as it did from right to left. We didn't know how many RNA molecules were involved. There were some little structures in the cell. Some thought they had 2 fibers in the middle. Some thought they didn't. Turned out they were both right. Some do and some didn't. All of that uncertainty was in there right then. In fact, some people sometimes come up to me irately, and say, "The Bible isn't a textbook of science." And I say, "You're right about that. I've written 5 textbooks of science. They've all had to be revised. The Bible has never had to be revised once." In that case of the DNA program, as a matter of fact, when I wrote the 2nd edition of that, I thumbed through the 1st edition and just laid it aside. Started on blank yellow paper, so much had changed since then. And suddenly it dawned on me that there were really only 2 choices. Either I could trust the word of experts who weren't there, who don't know everything, who are just as sinful as I am, or I could trust the word of one who was there, who does know everything, and who loved me very much. And suddenly the idea of believing that God really was speaking in His Word, that God could write a book in which He said what He meant and meant what He said, suddenly that idea began to have a lot of appeal. And God convinced me through His Spirit that He really was speaking in His Word, and I became a Christian. This is the next step in that story. As soon as I became a Christian, my wife and I began to get along ever so much better. The children began to behave beautifully. The dean gave a little dinner in my honor and put me on all the important faculty committees. Not quite, is it? Actually, the time of first belief really is a special time. It seems like your feet can hardly reach the ground. You're just so ecstatically happy. But then it seems like almost on purpose, the Lord lets us have a time of second thoughts, of doubts and so on, as we begin to re-examine what our faith really means. Even as our Lord Jesus at the beginning of His public ministry, endured temptations that we would could even think about enduring. And for me as a biologist, one of the big problems, what to do with all the so-called mountains of evidence for evolution. Well, you've seen the cartoons, a little light bulb goes on. I've got the answer. All that stuff about evolution is true, but God did it. Now, at the time, I thought that was an original idea. I've learned since, of course, it's a very common idea, sometimes called theistic evolution, sometimes called progressive creation. And at first, it seemed to solve all of the problems I had in this regard. I could go to church on Sunday and still believe everything that was written in the Bible like all the people going to church did, and I could still use my old yellow lecture notes in biology class on Monday to teach all that stuff about evolution. A perfect solution to the problem, or so it seemed for a little while. But the more I thought about it, the less that really seemed to work. And logically, plan and purpose are the logical opposites of time and chance. Could God use chance on purpose? If He did, it wasn't really chance. If it really was chance, it wasn't on purpose. But even more importantly was the evolutionary process itself. In summarizing his ideas, Darwin put it this way in the closing paragraphs of The Origin of Species. Most people who try to put evolution and the Christian faith together have kind of a romanticized idea about what evolution is all about. They think of it as upward, onward progress, and that sounds like something God might do. But Darwin put it this way: from the war of nature, famine and death, the production of higher animals directly follows. The war of nature, famine and death, a constant struggle, not just a struggle, but a struggle absolutely to the death. Even the evolution of cooperation can only proceed over the dead bodies of all those who don't cooperate. In fact, the struggle to the death is among brothers and sisters. It's really intraspecific. It's competition among those. See whose genes are going to win out in that generation and get passed on to the next. It's a very close-to-home struggle to the absolute death. Even plants, not quite as vicious in plants, but nevertheless it's the same thing. Somebody's got to die in order for the percentage of genes to change in the next population. And I began to think about the way God described the created world. He talked about it all very good. The same God in Genesis 6 tells us he was grieved to his heart at the violence and corruption that filled the earth. It's a God who says death is a curse. It's not his means of creation. It's something we're going to be saved from by the Lord Jesus Christ. It would hardly seem to be the way God would create the world, death, struggle, and pain, if he's going to deliver us from those very things. And it just didn't seem to add up. The evolutionary process didn't seem at all to be a way that God might create. In fact, it's not even a creative process. So I began to worry about that and think about that, and I have to tell you, to be quite honest, I'm not sure I could have ever gotten myself out of that dilemma alone. But that's the good news. God doesn't expect us to do it all alone. We've got one another. And in this particular case, the Christian university where I was teaching made a mistake. They hired a biologist who was a Christian, who was a creationist already, and he was interested in sharing some of the stuff about the Christian faith with me, a new Christian, in some of the creation material. So he showed up at my house with a copy of that very famous or infamous book, The Genesis Flood, by Drs. Henry Morris and John Whitcomb. And he said, well, let's read it together and I'll introduce you to the ideas of creation. So we sat down together and started reading a few paragraphs, and I jumped to my feet. Don't these people know anything about this? Don't they know that? Don't they know the other? And so on. Got all frustrated, so on. He got me calmed down, sat me down. Read another few paragraphs. Same thing. Got to my feet all irate and irritated and stuff like that. Finally, Alan said, why don't I just let you read it on your own and we'll talk about it when you're done? And so that's what he did. I began to read it, partly because it was so irritating. Well, of course, now I work for Dr. Morris. So he's the president of the Institute for Creation Research back in America. I've never had the courage to show him the nasty notes I wrote on the early pages of his book. But by the time I got to the middle, I began to kind of wonder, you know, why I felt sort of cheated. Why had no one ever pointed out to me before the problems, the errors, and so on in evolution? By the time I got toward the end of the book, I began to wonder, why had nobody ever presented to me the ideas of creation, the evidence of creation? And when I finished the book, boy, oh boy, it was just exciting and thrilling. Now that book dealt mainly with geology, and so I began to look for evidence of creation in my own special area of biology, and it was just everywhere. Quite frankly, it's a little embarrassing because the evidence was there, right there in the very things that I was teaching and talking about all the time, and I couldn't see it. A living illustration of Romans 1. You know, just suppressing the truth that really was obvious enough, so clear that by God's Spirit, when he removed the blindness of my eyes, it was so clear. I just felt mad at myself for not being able to see it. Well, then I began to present some of this evidence for creation like I've been sharing with you the last few days in the biology class there. Now you might think, aha! You know, here the university, a Christian university, houses a non-Christian evolutionist. Now they've got a Christian creationist practicing his faith in the classroom. It looks like an ideal thing. Now the dean really does give a dinner in my honor, puts me on all the important faculty committees. No, didn't happen this time either. Instead, I got challenged to a debate. By whom? By members of the Bible department. At this particular Christian college, and I might want to put Christian in quotes now, at this particular Christian university, the Bible department was teaching that the Old Testament was a collection of Babylonian myths and fables, and that Yahweh or Jehovah was the tribal war god of the Hebrew nation, bore no relationship at all to Jesus Christ, the God of love in the New Testament. And so here they were going through the Bible line by line in the Old Testament courses, pointing out this error and that mistake and this corruption and that bad doctrine and all this and that and the other stuff. And here I was in my science classes saying, this is great. This is the absolute Word of God. It tells us how it really happened. It's trustworthy in history and science, everything else. That was too much for the Bible department. So they challenged me to a debate. Well, there were 3 of them and only 1 of me, and they didn't want me to have all the underdog sympathy, so they said, you get some help, so it'll be 3 on 3. So I got the biologist and the chemist. And so here was the great debate. The Bible department defending evolution, the science department defending creation. I wish that were just an amusing anecdote, but unfortunately it's a worldwide phenomenon. Isn't it really a tragedy that it's really and this is something, by the way, that the American press cannot understand. That belief and acceptance in creation in America is growing most rapidly among those with a training in science. The more training you have in science, the more likely you are to find the creation arguments appealing. And so that's a major mystery to them. And yet we've had the same experience here in Australia, the same sort of thing. It was last time I was here, there was a school, that wanted to have us in there. Well, was this in Sydney? I think it was, or in the Sydney area. And, the RE teachers, religious education teachers, we don't want that creation in our classroom. What's creation got to do with religious education? They didn't want to have us in there. You know what? How the Lord worked that one out? The science masters said, we'll take you. And they had Ken over for 6 classes in a row. And so that's happened. The same thing in Sweden. I was in Sweden a few years ago, and again, there's a growing creation movement in Sweden, and the people that are doing it are the young professionals and the graduate students in science. Those are the ones that are enthused about creation. You know where their biggest opposition is? The state church. They can't hardly get a meeting in a church at all. They can get university meetings, but hardly any in the churches. It's a real tragedy. And so that's one way, again, that we think this creation science ministry is so foundational, not to convert the atheists, to something, but to get the church back to the foundations of God's Word in Genesis. That's a big, major thing we've got to do right away while we witness to the world as well. Well, at the end of the debate, nobody asked me anymore about the evidence from biology. But some of my friends said, look, Parker, if you only knew something about the geological evidence, then you give up this creation nonsense and come on into the 20th century with the rest of us. Well, about that time, the Lord did one of the nicest things He's ever done for me. A grant from the National Science Foundation back in America to go back to school to update my major in molecular biology and add a whole new cognate or minor in paleontology, study of fossils. I've never been as rich since. I'll never be as rich like that again. It was a fantastic grant, even with 4 children. I was living in the lap of luxury practically while I was doing these studies. And it really, at this time, I knew I was a Christian. I was pretty sure I was a creationist. But if the fossils didn't work out, I just wouldn't tell anybody about it. And I'm sorry to say, I've never been a man of great courage. I don't know how I get involved in some of the things I get to. Certainly I never suffer from a feeling of adequacy. But at any rate, this is the way I looked. I was just going back in fear and timidity and so on. I hadn't yet learned, that God had given us a spirit of boldness and victory. That was still coming yet. And so I went back and resolved to see what was going to happen. And so one of the first classes I had a chance to take was the one in astronomy. And I got the geology department to permit me to go ahead and take that course because according to the catalog, that's where I was going to learn about the origin of the universe, the Big Bang that started it all. So I wanted to know about that. Got into the class and really got involved in it. Very beautiful class, a lot of descriptive astronomy and stuff like that. But when it came to the origin of the universe, the fellow says, stellar evolution, the evolution of stars, that's aging. I thought, that's aging? That doesn't sound like evolution. That sounds like Hebrews 1. The heavens are growing old and wearing out like a garment to be cast off. Then he said, let's talk now about the nebular hypothesis. This idea that gas clouds condense under the influence of gravity to make stars. They pull together to make chunks of matter like that. Well, you've got to admit that's logical. Because you've seen it, on a cold day when you throw a few logs in the fireplace and the smoke begins to go up the chimney. And when it's real cold, gravity pulls the smoke together and you hear these little chunks bouncing off the roof. No, it doesn't happen that way, does it? And as a matter of fact, it doesn't happen that way anywhere else either. And even the fellow who invented the theory, the nebular hypothesis, it's when you do the calculation, sure enough, you got a big cold gas cloud, gravity will start to pull the particles together. But as they do, they heat up. You begin to get random thermal motion as you change kinetic gravitational potential energy into kinetic energy. You get a gas pressure that then pushes the stuff back out again. And every time, no matter what you use, the gas pressure pushing out is always 60 to 100,000 times greater than the gravity pulling in. In fact, one theory is to get those gas clouds together, you have a gas cloud surrounded by a sphere of stars that all explode at the same time and push the cloud together. Well, that wouldn't help. It would take stars to make stars, and you wouldn't be anywhere. Besides that, when they simulate it in the lab, it does just what you think. It makes the gas cloud break up even faster than it would otherwise. And so at the end of this discussion of this gas cloud formation, the fellow kind of chuckled and said, maybe we should call it the nebulous hypothesis, meaning a fuzzy idea. So here again, it was a little better than I thought. I wasn't expecting it to be quite that easy. Well, the next course I got into was fossil plants, paleobotany. So I show up, get a seat right on the front, didn't want to miss a thing. The prof comes in fashionably late, says, I suppose you all are here to learn about the evolution of plants. And I nodded. I at least wanted to know what the stories were going to be. He says, well, you aren't going to learn much. Surprised me. Says Charles Darwin wrote over 120 years ago that the origin of flowering plants is, quote, an abominable mystery, unquote. He says nothing has happened in the last 120 years to change that any. Oh, just amazing. And sure enough, all we studied was petrified plant anatomy. Do you realize in looking at the full range of fossil plants, I never found one new morphological structure, one new reproductive structure, nothing any different than plants have at the present time. And you know, the first land plants that stand up on land, they've got all those marvelous adaptations, those little cells, the guard cells that open and close like that, and all the kind of wood fibers that they need, all this right perfect just from the word go. And in fact, the only thing we discovered is the earth once had many more plants on it than it has at the present time. Looked like the creation of complex and separate kinds followed by catastrophic extinction of many of the kinds. So that wasn't too bad. I was beginning to get a little courage, even a weak fellow like me. But the next course was animal fossils. And now this was offered by the geology department instead of the biology department. I warned my wife, says, we're in trouble. I'm going to have to stay up way past midnight and do study after study after study after study to try to catch up with these geology majors. You know, that at that time I didn't have much background in geology. And boy, oh boy, is it going to take a long time for me to, you know, catch up with their background. Well, we got into the course in animal fossils, and here we were talking about cephalopods and gastropods and pelecypods and amphipods and decapods and all of these other pods that biology is famous for. I was right at home. The place was practically pure Latin. The geology majors, you should have seen them sweat. Now, where do you get names like this? Who was it? And they were the ones staying up past midnight. I hardly learned any new names. They were the names that were already familiar to me from, you know, studying ordinary animals that live on Earth at the present time. And the big difference was this. I'd go up to the biology lab, and the fellow said, today we're going to study clams. So he'd reach down in that foul-smelling tank of stuff, some of you know what I mean, pull out this clam and say, tap, tap, that's the shell, that's not interesting. We're going to study the soft parts. Well, that afternoon, I'd go down to geology, and he'd say, today we're going to study clams. Reach in there and pull out a clam. Now, to me, it looked pretty much like the same clam I just studied. He said, that soft stuff, that stinks. That belongs to biology. We're going to study the shell. That was a big difference. One studied the inside, one studied the outside. But if you actually ask, you know, where did clams come from in the first place? You dig all the way down through the rock layers, all over the earth and so on, right down to you quit finding fossils, and clams come from, guess what? Clams. Snails come from, guess what? Snails. You dig all the way down there, and snails we've got in our museum back in San Diego. And by the way, my wife, presumably, is up there in Brisbane right now building a public museum. Well, not building. Helping to arrange displays for a public museum up there. That's been a tremendous witness. Just these museum outreach in America. We've had a lot of people come to Christ right in the museum, as well as other people write back letters to us. You know, this really is a stumbling block. Boy, you remove that stumbling block, and the love of the Lord just gets in a tremendous way. It's just fantastic, and we hope we can do something like that here. But at any rate, we've got museum displays. We've got the oldest clams right next to clam shells we pick up off the beach. And you just see long, skinny ones, short, fat ones, same thing, snails with low spires, high spires, and so on. The one thing you can see, clams is clams, snails is snails. Trilobites, again, they start off complex and separate. They're never anything else. As my wife said one time, the one thing you never find are snams or clails or clamobites. Something halfway in between there. I do have to give the geologists some credit, though. When they study a clamshell, they study a clamshell. So the next time you're walking along the beach, keep your eye open for a heterodont, dimyarian, intragroppaliate, opisthedetic, prosogyrate, polypsopod. All that's half a clamshell. But as far as origins are concerned, clams are clams, snails are snails, right from their very beginning. So again, I was beginning to pick up a little bit of courage along this line. The next course was stratigraphy, the study of those rock layers and how those rock layers are stacked on top of one another. That's where it's supposed to take millions and millions of years to stack all those rock layers up like that. And of course, as I mentioned, one of the best areas to study that is out in Grand Canyon. Here you see 1.5 kilometers of rock layers stacked up that stretch out for thousands and thousands of square kilometers. And the evolutionist says usually, well, that takes millions of years to stack up that much rock that deep and that wide. Exactly the opposite. If it did take a long time, Grand Canyon wouldn't look like a giant layer cake. It would look like a chocolate vanilla swirl cake with all the rock layers mixed up. Think about a river like in America, the Mississippi River. The evolutionists want you to think of that bringing sediment down, dumping it in the Gulf of Mexico, gradually filling in the Gulf of Mexico and so. But slow, gradual processes don't make rock layers. They'll mix them together. So in the spring, when there's a lot of water flow, the gravel is washed far out. As the river flow settles down, then the sand settles where the gravel was, then clay where the gravel was. So you're mixing rock type. How many fossils you're forming? Virtually none in slow, gradual conditions. Instead, we do know one thing, that we'll deposit lots and lots of rock layer in layers like this and fast enough to trap fossils. Giant flood currents would seem to be exactly what you need to form things like that. One evidence of how fast they can form is a widespread existence of polystratic fossils. And Ken mentioned these in coal. And my prof, and again, this is an evolutionist, but he was talking one day in class about a layer of rock about this thick and the microscopic fossils called conodonts inside it. It was supposed to involve about 20 million years of evolutionary time. So I was just busy taking notes on how to zone rocks using conodonts. He said, then I followed this rock layer down the creek bed. And he said, here was a shellfish, nautiloid with a shape, an ice cream cone shaped shell, nice little cone like that, perched on its tip end, cutting through the whole 20 million years. He said, how can that be? I thought, good question. How could it just perch on its end like that for 20 million years while all the sand gradually accumulated? How could it stab itself down through hard rock? So I'm waiting for him to answer the question, and instead he says, these things are a real mystery, and wrote the name polystratic fossil on the board. And boy, I am beginning to get a little bit of courage at this point. By the way, by the time I finally left graduate school, I was willing to tell people I was a creationist in fear and trembling. But this was a big one here. And as a matter of fact, this is widely recognized even by our critics. David Raup is an evolutionist, but he's knowledgeable about creation. And he mentions in his article, even though he doesn't go along with the whole creation scenario, he says the creationists are right about this. The only way you can get polystratic fossils like this in coal or in the deposits I just mentioned is rapid burial. He says they're just plain right about that one. Well, then I got to the course that I was really fearing and dreading, geophysics. Now, apparently, the Lord knew I was moving to California. That's where we studied earthquake prediction. But the reason I took the course was radiometric dating. That's the one that I really wanted to find out about. And I was just afraid that here it was really going to be all in favor of evolution. You've seen these charts. And here you have, things like this, rubidium and strontium, the best of all the radiometric methods. I was in a debate at Portland State with an evolutionist one time. He spent his whole hour not just on the age of the Earth, not just on age dating, but on the rubidium-strontium method of age dating. It was the only one he felt he could have confidence in. And that's where you get ages like 1,160,000,000 years, 1,100,000,000 years, and so on and so forth. You can graph these things, get some estimate of the amount of daughter element and so on. The problem is, look at this. This is an article from Science that even with this best of all the methods, these ages are grossly in excess of the true age, 70 million to 3,000 million years older than the rocks really are. In fact, you can get 3 billion-year-old dates on lava flows observed in historical times. We were given a problem in that geophysics class. After he explained how the method worked and so on, he gave us real data, right out of the field. It says, calculate the age of this rock on the basis of these 2 rubidium-strontium samples. So I went home, plugged in the set of data number 1, got an age of the rock, plugged in data number 2, got an age of the rock that was nearly 10 times different Then oh no, I said, I made an arithmetic mistake. So I went through and tried to check it. Did stay up past midnight that time. Couldn't get the two answers to agree. So I felt kind of bad. I must not have understood the method. And I'm walking to class the next day, asked my friend, did you get that problem to work out? No, I couldn't get it to work. So we all walk in kind of mystified and sheepish that we didn't understand it. The process, no, I just wanted to show you the method doesn't always work. Oh, how close he came to tar and feathers. And speaking of methods that don't work, there's that one we talked about, Lucy. And that one that's, I would say, has now got to be dropped off the list of human ancestors and so. But when Donald Johanson discovered Lucy, of course, he was quite interested to know how old Lucy was because he wanted his discovery to be older than the Leakeys, so his fossil could be the really important ones and the Leakeys would be just, on the side. So he sent back some volcanic ash to Aronson at Case Western Reserve University. He says, how old is this rock material that Lucy's buried under? So first of all, he did potassium-argon dating, very, very common, the most commonly used, although also the most problems. Did a potassium-argon date, 2.9 plus or minus 0.2 million years, just a little under 3 million years. Not satisfied with that for sure, he checked it with a fission track method, checked it against the paleomagnetic charts. Sure enough, he sends back to Johanson a little under 3 million years. Johanson's writing about this in his book. He says, oh, shucks. I can't be the ancestor of the Lucy's finds. Theirs are the same age. He writes a few more pages. A few months later, Aronson sends him another date, 3.5 million years. Johanson says, I'll take it. But nobody bothers to ask if the first date, checked 3 different ways, was wrong, why would the second date be any better? And that's not the end of the story. Several months later, another person did an independent date, chopped 750,000 years off the date for Lucy. And the news writer for Science News interviewed the man who'd done the original 2 dates and says, what do you think about this new date for Lucy? He says, I can live with it. That's how confident he was in the 4 dates that he'd done. Sure, I can live with the new date. I didn't think I was right anyway. That kind of attitude, had no problem at all. And by the way, this is all written up in Science News under the interesting title, Lucy, the Trouble with Dating an Older Woman. In San Diego, we also have the trouble with dating an older man. There was a skull found in the sea cliffs above San Diego called Del Mar Man. That's a little San Diego suburb. And Jeffrey Bott at the University of California in San Diego there used a new method, amino acid racemization, to date that and got an age of 40,000 years, much older than most evolutionists believe man had been in North America. But the method seemed to work, and he stuck by his date and so on and so on for several years, until he finally had to withdraw it himself. And you know why? He had calibrated his amino acid racemization method against carbon-14, and nobody had told him carbon-14 was in error. And so he'd used a rubber band as a yardstick, so to speak, and he had to recalibrate the thing. And he was very mad at people for that, because it embarrassed him. But he brought the date from 40,000 years down to 5,000 years. And the newspaper man who wrote the story quipped, if Del Mar Man gets any younger, we're going to have to call in the homicide squad. This is the area that I thought was really going to be hardest for me to come to grips with as a Christian. And I suspect many of you know Christians who are really with you, on the creation side of things. They really know that God is involved, and maybe they know that God didn't use evolution, but still they think things are so old. It seems like the radiometric dates, have to be taken as rock-hard facts, and then we reinterpret the Scripture, rather than believing what God says and taking a second look at the radiometric dating techniques. And interestingly enough, in spite of the widespread acceptance of those dates, professionals in the field see the problems galore. And I think this is a real coup for ICR, the Institute for Creation Research back in America. We've just agreed to sign on a man who's been a professional in the carbon-14 dating technique for years and years. And he's seen firsthand how they chuck out the dates that don't agree. He's seen firsthand all the flaws in the method, and he says, I want out. He said, I want to be a creationist. I want to work with creationists in this area of geochronology. And Robert Gentry is another one, a leading expert in radiation physics, who's a devout creationist and very active in this particular area. Even though so many Christians, this is the hardest thing it seems like for them, but even evolutionists see the problems. And so what I've got in front of you here on the screen now is a page from a textbook written by an evolutionist for evolutionists, William Stansfield, at one of America's most prestigious university, California Polytechnical Institute up in San Luis Obispo. Here it's an evolutionist writing an evolution textbook for evolutionists. He goes through all the assumptions that are involved in the method and so. And he says it is obvious, I would just change that to it should be obvious, that radiometric techniques may not be the absolute dating methods they're claimed to be. Age estimates on a given geological stratum by different radiometric methods are often, not rarely, not occasionally, not once in a while, but often, quite different. Not a little bit different, not 1 or 2%, quite different, his parenthesis, sometimes by hundreds of millions of years. 99.99999% error. He says there is no absolutely reliable long-term radiologic clock. Why would anybody prefer something like that over the Word of God? Really when you see it, I think you can see the foolishness. But that's not the end of the story. He goes on to list about a dozen different evidences of a young Earth. Now that was really thrilling. Boy, when I first read that, I couldn't believe it. Here he pointed out all the problems of an old Earth. Now he is an evolutionist. He believes in an old Earth. But he says creationists submit evidence. And boy, do I appreciate that. The usual statement is fundamentalists, fanatics submit harebrained schemes. But no, creationists are scientists. They've got evidence that we have to look at. And he goes through about a dozen evidences that would look like young Earth. The amount of oil trapped in the Earth. Oil is under tremendous pressure. What happens when you poke a hole in it? Out it comes, a big gusher under pressure. Black gold, Texas tea, all that stuff. Excuse me, Texas tea. It's under so much pressure that all of the oil in the world would have leaked out, would have leaked to the surface in less than 100 to 200,000 years. But there's a lot of it left. A lot of it's in the wrong place politically, but there's a lot of it left, which would mean the Earth would have to be far younger than that. The amount of helium in the atmosphere is nowhere near what it ought to be for an ancient Earth. The amount of uranium salts dissolved in the ocean, nowhere near what it ought to be for an ancient Earth. I have a Christian friend who likes a lot of things about creation, but still believes in millions of years, till a friend of his at the Naval Undersea Center had to find out how much of a certain radioactive isotope of chlorine was in the ocean. And it's top secret. He can't tell me why he wanted to know. But he went out there and he knew how much there should be based on a 4.5 billion year Earth. And he found 1/100 millionth what he thought, and they had to drop the project. There wasn't enough of it to measure. That interesting. And so he goes through all these evidences of a young Earth. But my favorite is carbon-14. And so carbon-14 now has a short half-life, just 5,730 years. So you wouldn't ordinarily think of it in terms of the total age of the Earth. But it comes in this way. I want you to imagine here that you've been given a kind of a soft job. You're trying to fill a leaky barrel with a garden hose. And so here you are getting paid by the hour, not paying too much attention. Turn on the hose, and the water begins to flow into the barrel, but you're not paying attention. It begins to leak out as well. So you look in there, the barrel's a tenth full, an eighth full, a quarter full, a third full, a third full, a third full, a third full. It gets to a certain point where the water in equals the water out. So that's the balance point. Well, that's kind of like carbon-14 in our atmosphere. The atmosphere is kind of a barrel for holding carbon-14, and carbon-14 is poured in by high-energy bombardment of nitrogen-14, and then it leaks out by radioactive decay. So you've got carbon-14 in, carbon-14 out. When Libby invented the method back in the 1950s, he says, well, what's the balance point? That's where the carbon-14 clock starts ticking. And he calculated that it would be in balance in 30,000 years. He says, everybody knows the Earth is older than 30,000 years. It must be in balance. Well, the atmospheric scientists back then told him, hey, it's not in balance. Watch it. Caution. Alert. He didn't pay any attention to them. And sure enough, it's not in balance. And as Stansfield says in that article, the creationists are right about the facts. What I just told you is really common knowledge among experts. Carbon-14 decay rate in the upper atmosphere is quite a bit less than its production rate, or than its decay rate. And so we're right about the imbalance on carbon-14 down here. But what's really intriguing is what he does with this. Now remember, he is an evolutionist who believes in evolution. But look how he gets around it. He says creationists argue, that the age of the atmosphere would be less than 20,000 years, in fact a lot closer to 10. He says it is possible that a greater concentration of water vapor existed. That may remind some of you of the creationist water vapor canopy idea. In fact, that's very helpful. It helps us explain past climates and a whole bunch of things. But notice, it's possible a greater concentration of water vapor existed prior to the, can you read those little words? biblical flood with a capital B yet, right there in the middle of this evolution text. Then his parenthesis, presumably about 5,000 years ago. Better dating than many theologians, I might say. And so here's an evolutionist. He says, I know the answer to carbon-14. It was a biblical flood 5,000 years ago that did it. What do I say? Amen. Right on. And so here we have Christians that are still, worried about these things, and yet the evidence seems so clear. And again, it's easier to line up. As Ken tells you, you can't prove it one way or another, but you can actually line up more support for a young earth than for an old one. Well, the end of that class I had, we actually summarized our last assignment in the geophysics class was to list the assumptions that you have to make before you can begin to use the radiometric dating method. I listed 14 different assumptions, got a check plus on the assignment. We were going over these in class, and going over assumptions after assumption after assumption. And the prof said, if a Bible-believing Christian ever got hold of this stuff, he had no idea there was one in the class. I didn't have courage to tell anybody yet. Said if a Bible-believing Christian ever got hold of this stuff, he'd make havoc out of the dating system. So he chuckled one more time and he said, so keep the faith. Keep the faith. That was his final admonition. Keep the faith. That was all there was. But it's not like faith in God, is it? It was an empty faith. A faith that was contrary to the facts that we have now. And I thought, boy, if it's a matter of keeping faith, I'd rather keep a faith that fits the facts. A faith that's based on the word of one who was there, who does know everything, and even more importantly, who really does love me. And so if it's a matter of keeping faith, may I suggest that one of the best summaries for that is the one that Ken gave you a little while back. Now, that kind of faith is summarized in many areas in the Bible, but that one that's kind of special, for in 6 days the Lord God made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is. Wow. At first, when I was a new Christian, it just seemed so incomprehensible. But as I grew to know God better, as His Spirit became more alive in my life, I changed the question around. The new question was, God, why did you take so long? You could have done it like that. And the interesting thing is, that's not just my testimony. There are many other scientists that share the same one. That Charles Duke, that went to the moon and brought back one of the moon box, went up as an evolutionist, came back as a creationist. Dean Kenyon taught evolution at San Francisco State University till some students just brought him some books and said, do you want to read these and talk about creation? He read them with the object of refuting them and couldn't. And now he's an active creationist and a full-fledged Christian taking a part in this particular thing. One thing that happened that was kind of dramatic to me, I told you at the beginning of the talk on human origins about that Canadian Broadcasting Corporation production. Well, the producer of that was Tom Kelly. And at first I met Tom. He seemed to be a nice enough guy, but I've had that before and get stabbed in the back. I didn't know what kind of person he was. But at the end of it, he wrote me this letter. And he interviewed me as a creationist, went all over Canada interviewing evolutionists. And then he wrote me this letter back. Thanks for all your help. I enjoyed meeting you. For the record, so I assume he doesn't mind my sharing it, I started into the program as an evolutionist. Okay, that was his bias, his assumption to start with. But then look what he says. I started into the program as an evolutionist without knowing why or quite what that meant. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you don't have members of your family, friends and neighbors. Well, they're an evolutionist, isn't everybody? But they don't know why, and they really don't know what it means. Otherwise, they wouldn't try to put it together with the Bible if they really knew what it was all about. That's what he's saying. I was an evolutionist, sort of, isn't everybody, without knowing why or quite what it meant. By the time I'd done the research of one thing, I was sure that if evolution is true, and boy, oh boy, that's a good basis for prayer, that doubt's already in his mind, that time and chance processes just don't wash. And after he looked at all of the evidence, interviewed the evidence, and evolutionists and so on, the idea that time and chance put the world together, he couldn't believe it. If it wasn't time and chance, what is it? It's plan and purpose. And if it's plan and purpose, that's not evolution, that's creation. Well, if God can begin to work in the heart of a television producer like this, He can work with your family. He can work with your friends. He can work with your neighbors. He can work with our societies in Australia and in America. What does it take to change lives? That's what the creation ministry is all about, changing lives for Christ. What does it take? Informed Christians. Christians ready to give a reason for the hope that's within them. And so that's why we're so anxious to share our reasons, our testimony with you, so that you can pass them on, and together we might bring healing and restoration to God's world.